Just to kind of give you everyone sort of a baseline of what sort of the expectations are for today is I'm kind of assuming that if you're here, you're interested in sort of either you're interested in web development, or you're interested in sort of how people like myself are putting together sort of visualizations and how to specifically sort of work with a specific audience. So in my case, I work with a lot of faculty members. So in that case, I'll be sort of walking through one particular project and kind of making sure that I talk about all the little steps in between that are not so much coding development, but mostly understanding that user, understanding the user group that I'll be developing for. So again, if you're interested in the web development side, we'll have some information about that. And we'll be talking a lot about the human factors, so that connection between the person and the actual sort of final product, if you will. What I'm going to do now is share my screen. So share. There are a couple slides with this that are going to have some sound. I typically don't like to do this, just kind of going online and kind of having sort of a secondary sort of video playing while I'm kind of doing my presentation. But I have a couple small videos. They're only about 2 to 3 minutes long in total. But hopefully this will work out as it should. So let me share my screen. And again, if someone in the chat can just kind of let me know that you guys can see what I'm seeing in terms of the presentation on my screen, again, that would be very helpful just to make sure that we're all starting at the same sort of place. Yep, okay, sounds good. All right, thank you, everybody. So let me get started here. And over here. Okay. All right, so let me make this full screen and start going. Okay. So I want to move this way 1 second, sorry. Actually, that'll be fine right where it is, so I'll move it down just a little bit. Okay, so yes, just getting started with this. Basically, the idea of today is to talk about sort of starting a project and sort of hitting the end of the project as well, all the little steps in between. The project I'll be talking about is actually a project I worked on about a few months ago with one of the faculty members here at HUC, Institute for Life Sciences. Specifically, we're going to be sort of walking through, that first conversation to looking at the data to getting some prototypes together to sort of kind of having a final sort of product at the end of all of this. So basically, we'll kind of be walking through all those sort of incremental steps, and hopefully you'll be able to sort of pull some information from how this development process actually goes through, and sort of how we refine the sort of prototypes and ideas and sort of get to a final product. A little about myself, I should mention, my name is Patrick Dudas, and I actually would like to do a little special thanks to Institute for CyberSciences, who helped me market this particular workshop. And in terms of teaching learning technology, when I have the live version, we have a room set up for Althouse Labs, and they're nice enough to lend me that location for those particular talks. A little bit about myself. My PhD is through the University of Pittsburgh, where I was specifically information sciences, and I was specifically looking at data visualization, social media, and data mining. And I actually currently support a large sort of portion of the university here at Penn State through the HUC Institute for Life Sciences, Institute for CyberSciences, and the Eberly College of Sciences as well. A couple things I'll make note of in terms of, a little bit. A couple things to make note of is the fact that, when it comes to these workshops, I kind of think about this in terms of 4 different dimensions when we talk about sort of this development process. One is the UI UX, which stands for user interface and user experience. So basically a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about today, the data and sort of how we put the product together. Coding in terms of putting, developing the ideas and putting them to a point where we can actually see them online or put them in a way that we can sort of make use out of them. And finally, art, so sort of aesthetics or sort of how things are looking and sort of how, if it's eye-catching or if it's something where it sort of gets people sort of involved or interested in sort of what we're trying, the story we're specifically trying to tell. At the bottom of the screen, I have my GitHub account, Dudas PM, and I'll give me 1 second. I'm actually going to showcase that. If you go to my GitHub account, I'll throw that link into our chat. So if you go there, you're going to be able to see something called Data Workshops. And in there, you're going to see all the workshops that I've developed for specifically that had some code involved with it. And what we'll be doing is working with Workshop 5. So I'll kind of leave it at there for now, but if you're interested, you can check out that to sort of get resources. There are a number of different things I'll be talking about. I'm not going to go into all the specifics of all these projects, if you will, but if you're interested, you can always go here and utilize this to actually run your own sort of visualizations specifically for that one. So again, all the resources used today will be located here. The final product that I ended up putting together was actually a couple. Sorry, should have had this. I forgot to get this rolling, but a couple of the projects, the final product for this was actually, I'll show right now, was looking at sort of connecting data specifically about antibody counts and how and when that data was being collected. So this top plot here, and we were mapping that specifically to a histogram at the bottom here. I'll showcase the data as well as we move forward, and you're going to find that it's not a lot of, only about 5 different columns of information, a lot of data points, but for the most part, kind of a simple idea. And what the professor or the faculty member was trying to do was to sort of walk through somebody through sort of an example kind of animation. So this was a video we put together, and this was our final product specifically for that. And I'll kind of let it play out for a couple more seconds here, but we'll get to kind of most of these steps today, and you'll have access to a lot of the code that you're seeing here. The text box is not presented, but for everything else is actually presented. So if you want to, again, you can reproduce this particular graph later on if you would like to. Let me back out of this. Okay, and okay. So I just showed the case of the final product. So today what we'll be covering specifically is the development of the project in terms of some human factors. And human factors are exactly how it sounds specifically. It's basically thinking about that end user, that person sort of that'll be utilizing something like this. And it goes into a lot of those topics in terms of design. I'll walk you through the project itself. We'll talk about something called paper prototypes and how you can think about them utilizing something called iterative design. Front-end analysis is basically getting to know your end user better, basically sort of getting to know that information so you can sort of design specifically for that user group, and then finalizing our project. I break this presentation up into 2 sections, basically, and I have sort of markers as we go through the presentation. You'll be able to see this. One is the technical side, so what programs do I need to start this type of work if you're interested? How do I get these applications to work properly? Create graphs and things of that nature. And then on the human factor side, we're going to talk about steps to design. How do I talk to a specific audience or target a specific audience, and how many designs do I actually need to get a sort of a good final product? So we'll start off with this human factor side of this conversation. And there's a number of different topics that I could hit on, but I'll just kind of mention a few of them. Again, a lot of these have to go into a lot of the final products and final designs when I'm putting them together. One of the best resources for something like this is a wonderful book by Don Norman called The Design of Everyday Things. I've utilized it before for classes when I was teaching students, and it's still something I use today. And the design aspect in terms of, he talks about design is concerned with how things work and how they're controlled and the nature of interaction between people and technology. But specifically, he talks about different appliances, dishes, you can see here, he has a coffee pot. He talks about basically anything in terms of design. So it's not just limited to web page design or data visualization design. It's meant to be sort of an open discussion about any type of design. So a couple things in terms of why we see poor design. It's one of those situations where we don't notice it until we actually see it kind of situation where if we don't, when we see good design, we kind of just sort of take it for granted, unless it's something that's sort of novel or sort of remarkable in some way, shape, or form. But we notice those poor designs. Basically, you can think about this in terms of something that I always think about when it comes to poor design is whenever you go to like a shopping mall, or a grocery store or something like that, and you go to the checkout aisle and you go to swipe your credit card, and you notice that the fact that there's no sort of standardization with those types of devices. So in one situation, you might have to ask, do I swipe? Do I put my chip in? I have different button layouts, things of that nature. So that's sort of a broad example of sort of poor design, basically having all these different sort of ways to do the same sort of interaction. When it comes to design, a lot of things in terms of trade-offs kind of occur. Why do we have these trade-offs? Things like cost, a specific aesthetic choice, maintenance, experience of that matter. But most importantly, when it comes to human behavior, there's a lot of assumptions that are made, and it comes from the fact that people assume that because they're a person, that they innately understand that the human behavior behind all contexts, which is not the case. We have one perspective, and so we need to understand the other perspectives as well. This first slide, this is actually one of the videos I'll be showing now, but basically on the left-hand side, you should be able to see Don Norman. Don Norman, for some reason I said John. Don Norman, basically he's on the left-hand side there, and what he'll be talking about is something called a conceptual model. Basically a conceptual model is sort of an intuitive sort of layout or sort of arrangement of an object and how it's designed. And how well, basically we apply sort of our past experiences to that particular project or sort of object specifically. So it's basically sort of, if we can sort of design for that conceptual model, we're going to have a better chance of designing specifically so more people understand it intuitively. So I'm going to play this and hopefully everything works as planned. Oops, sorry.
Okay, I'm rolling.
Okay.
And we're good whenever you are.
Hi there. Happy Friday. Happy coffee.
One of the things both of us have talked about for a long time is the importance of a conceptual model. The fact that, the designer has some model of what this thing is, and the person using it is trying to figure out what the model is, and the only thing to go on is the device itself. And you said you had trouble with this, and it looks to me like it's a pretty straightforward bowl. So what's the story?
Well, I came across this at a hotel in Stockholm, Sweden. They had a whole big stack of them jumbled up for us to put our breakfast cereal in, and so I made the mistake of putting my breakfast cereal in it. So I poured the cereal into the bowl, and then I added some milk, and I do like my milk, so...
all the way up to the rim.
Yeah, because that's just the way I like it. And then I put it down on the table.
Ah!
Now that does not require a warning notice. That requires a redesign.
So the conceptual model of a bowl is that it's flat
yes.
and horizontal. And
that's what people expect.
And as long as you're holding it this way, it looks like it is, right?
Yes, and particularly the way it was jumbled one bowl on top of the other. Now what was it was intended for was to make a nice presentation for having the chef fill this bowl and then a waiter bring it out to your table. So they'd pressed it into a different service.
So wait a minute, you found this in a hotel in Sweden?
I'm going to pause it there, but if you're interested, you can watch sort of the rest of this. But again, just sort of gives you a little bit of an introduction to what a conceptual model is and when it breaks down sort of some of the issues you might run into. Keep an eye on the chat as well. Okay, the next topic we'll be talking about going into is, let me mute my sound so don't hear me twice, is going to be something called affordances and anti-affordances. So when we're thinking about developing a visualization or any kind of web page specifically, we're going to be thinking about sort of making things intuitive and making sure that people know that there's some sort of relationship between what they're seeing and how to interact with it. And affordances are basically that relationship between an actual object and sort of noticing how to utilize that or use that particular object intuitively without having to have instructions or something to sort of tell us exactly what it is. I have two examples. I'll go over this. The top right-hand side is actually a bad example of affordances, which is a little bit easier to kind of showcase versus a good affordances kind of idea. But what you see is basically, if you've ever gone to, I see this a lot in terms of like movie theaters, but it's basically that bar that goes between the two doors, and so when you walk up to it, you walk to the wrong side, and all of a sudden you're pushing on it, and you're kind of walking into the door kind of situation. You're supposed to push it, but you're not sure what angle to come from it to actually interact with it. The bottom right-hand corner is something called an anti-affordance. So we're trying to make people not do a certain action. So this is sort of a great example of that, where they used lines on the road, and basically the lines get closer and closer together. And what that sort of tells the person as they're driving is, even though they're trying to slow down to go 25 miles an hour, it's a situation because the lines are getting closer together, it's actually causing them to slow down even more, because it looks like the lines are sort of coming at the same speed, which is going to kind of make us want to slow down a little bit more in that regards. Okay. And so that's sort of an idea of that affordance versus anti-affordance idea. A signifier is basically attached to that affordance idea. It's more or less just a marker or a sign or a signal of some sort. So an exit sign is a very good example of this. Basically, it's telling you specifically what to do or what the action is that can occur at that point. Basically, if you want to be really good at design, you're going to have a signifier plus the affordance. But you can get away with either or. But for the most part, if you need a signifier, it basically is kind of one of those situations where maybe it's not as intuitive as you would like it to be. So just sort of a different sort of way of looking at it. Another topic is the idea of mapping. And this is sort of mapping what we sort of relationships between objects in this regard. So my example here at the bottom of the screen is we see that we have a situation where we have some various layouts of a stovetop. And so on the bottom left-hand corner, we have sort of more of a very poor design in terms of the mapping is sort of incorrect. It's sort of very difficult to actually figure out which of those knobs go to which of the burners. And it gets a little better as you kind of move from left to right, and then full mapping is basically a very intuitive mapping between those two different types of layouts, if you will. I can sort of attest to this because this is actually, what you're seeing here is actually my stovetop, and I used some white circles to highlight where the burners are specifically. But for this, it's sort of the same situation. If the top right-hand corner is actually where 1 goes to, bottom right-hand corner is 2, top left is 3, and then 4 is the bottom left-hand corner. So it's not intuitive in terms of making that connection between what we're seeing on the right-hand side and how the actual burners are laid out. And it's caused some issues before. Luckily, no one's ever been burnt or anything like that. But it's one of those situations where it's very, it's something you see a lot in terms of poor mapping between sort of the two objects being involved here. Okay, so in terms of our client, if you will, the faculty member I was working on, so we kind of hit some of the basics in terms of the human factor side. We're getting now into the sort of the project. There's a faculty member, Maciek, who here at Conceptual Life Sciences. And basically, I just wanted to, he approached me to help him put together an animation or a visualization to promote some of his research. And so basically, he reached out to me. He does all the mathematics, statistics, and of that nature. And so he came to me and said, "Hey, could you help me with a visualization that I'm trying to put together?" And for the most part, here's the data set. First, I'll make notes. There's obviously no sort of human data sort of to connect to any individual or anything like that. It's very, very, very high level in terms of he had an antibody counts, and don't ask me what disease or virus he's talking about. I specifically meant to kind of keep this at a very, very high level. So basically there was an antibody count or a value, so that's what you see on the left-hand side, and a date where this information was taken, so a test was done, and an infection date, so actual infection date. So the idea was the relationship was going to be, if it has a higher antibody count, we'd assume that the infection was a lot farther back, or vice versa in terms of lower values. This gets us into one of our topics, one of the main topics that I'll be talking about in terms of putting together some ideas, if you will. And this goes into this idea of sketching. So sketching is basically a very quick and crude way of actually getting ideas on a piece of paper. And what we'll do is I'll sit down and we'll think about things in terms of, developing ideas and having, working with a faculty member to communicate these ideas via a piece of paper and a pencil. Great for, design choices, ideation, sort of putting together these ideas. It's easy also to kind of think through the ideas, force ourselves to kind of visualize sort of a lot of the medium, and it also helps in terms of kind of getting a common ground between myself and the faculty member. Also, I can come back to these records in terms of I have these designs, so I can come back to them and sort of say, we started here, how did we sort of move from that process, and sort of reflect and do those, communicate between each other as I already mentioned. So this is actually one of the things I utilize a lot in terms of my designs. I have a sketchbook and a number of colored pencils. And what I'll do is I'll sit down with that faculty member and I'll open that up in terms of the colored pencils, and I'll let them sort of walk me through and use colors and different, draw out what they're thinking specifically. So it allows me to actually very easily sort of connect to them and sort of ask questions without doing a lot of design aspects. I know this is a little bit difficult to see. I think it's a little bit better in the actual presentation, but this was actually one of our first drawings and sort of our first kind of starting points, if you will. And as you can kind of see here, the top graph and the bottom graph kind of emulate a lot of what we see in sort of the final product. Basically sort of having the antibody count going up the y-axis and having the year, in this case it says 2013, and then mapping it back to some sort of histogram, if you will. So this was our first sort of just, conversation piece to kind of get us going in terms of seeing, putting an idea together. And one of the, I have a couple prototypes I'm going to show here, but one of the nice things about sort of doing these sketches is the fact that I'm not developing anything. There's not a lot of sort of expectation in terms of, this development process. We can have an easy conversation. I don't have to, code something, come to him, come back, and sort of situation. And again, this is just for sort of a good starting conversation. And again, it's a lot easier for me to take that piece of paper and, throw it away versus doing a lot of coding and development beforehand. So this is, again, sort of that sort of first sort of way of looking at this, if you will. I have a couple quick little examples. I'm going to kind of show about 20 seconds of each of them. Basically, there's let me pause that. Sorry, let me mute that. We don't need sound for these ones. But for these ones, basically, they're just kind of showing you different ways of doing paper prototypes. So on the right-hand side, we have a situation where they just take, taking pieces of paper, folding it up, layering on top of one another. A lot more sort of, I'll say, more, a little bit more fidelity in terms of the prototype, but for the most part, it kind of gets that idea across pretty quickly. The one on the left-hand side, here's that as well. And basically, let me just kind of skip forward. It's a very, very detailed sort of paper prototype, if you will. So again, I won't go through the entire video, but kind of gives you an idea of how elaborate some of these can be actually. So they're using some sticks to actually move and have the changing of the character, the hair of the character, the facial features, things of that nature. They have a sort of a player in they're designing a game of some sort, and so they have a lot of detail and a lot of movement and stuff like that. Again, a little more detail than I usually get into, but for the most part, another kind of cool way of actually doing, game design in this case without having to do any kind of coding. Okay, so now we're going to be walking into the more technical side of things. So to this point, we've kind of walked through kind of the idea of putting together, thinking about the project and how we're starting that particular project. This first step is actually getting us more into the conversation of if you're interested in developing a web, a web project or something like that, how you would actually go about doing so. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in terms of kind of going through some of these steps, but for the most part, the instructions are available through the presentation. But if you run into issues, please let me know. We can have a conversation after this one today. But for the most part, this is, to me, one of the more straightforward ways of doing this. When it comes to running a web server, if you're on a Mac, they natively have this sort of installed for you. But for Windows, you have to actually install something to get a web server actually up and running. So to do this, I provided a link, and I'll kind of walk through this a little bit. Apache is an open source product. Basically, it's sort of a way for you to download and again sort of install. It's a web server of some kind. If you already have access to a web server, a lot of this information you don't have to worry about. This is just as if you're interested in development and you want to do something that's local to your machine. The one I recommend is the Apache Lounge, so that button there. And if you are, again, a Windows user, more than likely you're going to use that Win64 version for most modern systems. And so we just click on that and we'll have a zip file at that point. All I need to do at this point is if I unzip this, so open it up, I'm going to have a folder called Apache 24. And all I need to do is open up my C drive and drop it in there. I'm not going to do that now because I already have one installed, but you just take it over and drop it over here. And for us, that's all you need to do to kind of get things installed, if you will. Again, it's one of those situations where I really like this installation because it doesn't really install anything per se. You're just running the actual server when you need it and when you don't need it kind of situation. Again, Macs have this built in sort of natively, so you actually don't need to do anything specific for that. So as I already mentioned, you'd go to the Apache, sort of drop it into the C folder, and you have it installed there. One thing I would like to mention, and I do recommend this very much so, is the fact that if you would run this Apache application, basically it opens your computer up to be a web server. It's actually what they would utilize on any kind of web server. So one thing you do want to edit is something it's called the httpd.config file. It's basically the config file for Apache. And what I'll do is I will open mine on here. So it's located at C:, and then Apache 24, and then inside the bin folder. Excuse me, the config folder. Sorry about that. Config, and then inside there's going to be a file called httpd.config. For Mac users, it's going to probably be at a different location. I kind of list ones that I've ran into, so I have let listed here. And all you need to do is actually just open up this file as a text file. So let me open that up. Open. I'll just expand this a bit. And for the most part, the main thing we want to change is, and you can either search for this or just scroll down, is this section right here. In this case, originally it's going to look like this, and it's going to have it's going to be saying listen 12.2.34.567880. What we want to do is just add a line here that says listen, and then this specific sort of number sequence, if you will. So 127.0.0.1:80. And all that means is basically it's only going to listen for traffic from that particular IP address, which is basically it actually is your local machine. So basically it won't allow any outside connections. It'll only let you as a developer go to this, go to that particular IP address, and you're the only one that is going to be able to see this. So it doesn't open up any kind of issues or anything like that, but basically it sort of locks it down. So only traffic that's going to be utilizing your web server is just your local machine specifically. And so what you'll do is make that edit, you'd save it. So I'll assume I saved it. Come back here. Again, you do that for both Mac and for the PC versions. You save the documents, and what we need to do now is basically start the web server, if you will. And again, I kind of like this because you're going to be actually starting the server, turning it off as well. Again, if you have access to a department web server that you sort of can develop on, that's the best scenario. But if you want to have a local instance, this is going to be how you're going to do it. I have both the Mac version and the Windows version. So for Windows, all you need to do is actually go to your little window icon at the bottom and type CMD. And this is going to bring up something called the command prompt. And all we need to do is navigate to where the actual application is. And so what I'll showcase is a couple really quick sort of commands, if you will, for you to get this actually accomplished. And this is true for not only Windows, but also for Mac or Linux or anything like that. The command is C as in Charlie, D as in David, and then space, ... And all this does is basically, if you see here, it says C users PMD19. If I run that, it moves me back one folder. And I do that again, and it takes me to the C drive. And now all I have to do is CD, and that means change directory to Apache, and then into bin. And so now I'm inside that bin folder. So let me, okay. So right now I'm in the bin folder, and all I need to do to start this actual server is type in httpd.exe and hit enter, and it'll start. I already have one running, so I don't want to. It won't let me run it again, because it's obviously already running for me. And so I'll run this, and basically, as long as this command prompt is open, the server is running. If I want to turn it off the server, I click the exit, the little X button, and the server's off. And what this again, this is going to be something where this now allows you to actually have a web server to actually develop and put your programs and start developing in that environment, if you will. So let me minimize this. Okay. And for Mac, it's a little bit different. You're going to open up a terminal, and to do that, I have some instructions. Up at the magnifying glass, you can just search terminal, and then you just have to run this particular command, and that'll get things going for you. And to test this, all we have to do is go into a browser. So in this case, I have my browser obviously already open. And what you would do is type in either that 127.0.0.1, which I'll do now. It's going to be a little bit different on my end versus what you'll see on your end. This is going to show you kind of all the projects that I'm working on, because I don't have the particular file. I've used this a lot, let's put it that way. You can either do that or do something called localhost. And if you type out localhost, it'll do the same exact thing. And again, localhost and that 127.0.0.1 is all local to your machine. It's not going out to the internet at all. It's basically just running everything locally. And what you should see on your end, if you're just doing this for the first time, you should see a window that pops up and it says it works. And that's it, basically. If you see that, it's working for you as it intended. The last thing I'll kind of make mention of is just to kind of get things going with our project today. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our GitHub account, and GitHub is a way to sort of publicly make projects available. It's a free service for people to utilize. So again, sort of something where if you're working on a project and you want to kind of get other people's feedback on it, and you're okay with it being sort of in the public space, if you will, GitHub is sort of a great way to do that. So let's go to GitHub real quick. And when you go to that particular site, again, it's going to take you to Dudas PM, my GitHub account, Data Workshop, which is the workshops for this particular, these data visualization workshop. You should see a button over here that says clone or download. You're going to click on that, and you're going to see an option for download zip. So you see at the bottom left-hand corner, downloaded. I can now open it. And what I want to do is actually drop that into, let me get that open. We're going to go under C, we're going to go to Apache. And then when you if you have projects you're going to start working on, where you want to put those particular projects is in the folder called htdocs. So I open up that, and again, for you, it's going to just have one single file. But for me, because I have obviously a lot of projects that I'm working on, you're going to see a lot more folders in here. But all we need to do is all you're going to do is unzip. Yeah, there it is. Unzip the folder and drop it directly into your htdocs folder. And you should see a file that's called data visualization master. And in there, you're going to see a couple projects, which is the ones we see right here. And we can actually start looking at some of these projects. So if you go in your web browser and go localhost, and you find that data workshop-master, workshop 5, and then let's say we start with start.html. There you go. You should see that web page pop up, and it should say very basic web page, or we can do basic, and you should see that basic web page visualization pop up for you as well. Okay. All right. Just try to keep an eye on the chat in case there's any kind of questions. So yeah, so this is how you go about sort of starting this whole process to actually get starting on development. So for the most part, if you can get to this point, you can start putting these projects together and developing some of these actual web projects or data visualizations, web data visualizations as well. Okay, back to the presentation. One thing I'll make note of is the fact that in terms of text editors that are available, the one I typically use is something called Notepad++. Here's a link to it. It's what you saw here. So basically, it's nice because it has different tabs, so you can sort of see multiple different pages you're working on. It'll encode each of the pages as well. So if I go and let's say I choose, this index page, it's going to encode things, so comments or a specific color, numbers or a certain color as well. So it just helps in terms of making it more readable in that regard. So here is our first design. And so basically, I took the data that we kind of talked about already and just plotted this out. And what I'd like to do is kind of just talk a little bit about designing a very basic web page and sort of how we got this first sort of visualization put together. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the further projects, if you will, only because the focus of today is to sort of focus on getting things started, if you will. But again, if you're interested, all the source code is made available to you. So my start.html, if you're new to development, this is basically what a web page is. This is any web page in terms of what you go to, Penn State or Google or anything like that. This is the basic structure of an HTML page or a web page. You have sort of some tags that sort of start and have a little slash that sort of ends things. That sort of tells you that this is an HTML page. And then you have two specific parts. You have the head or the header, and then the body. Basically, the body is where what you see when you go to that web page. So if I go through here and save and go back to here. And check that out. You see, I made a little small change to the body, and now that's showing up on the web page now. So that's just sort of the basic sort of structure, if you will. Now, in terms of the visualization, and again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time. I also try to go through and add documentation throughout this. So if you have any questions, you can kind of refer back to this and hopefully kind of walk through it. I use something called D3 to do most of my visualization. So let me show that real quick. D3 stands for data-driven documents. Again, open source, free library to utilize. It's something called JavaScript. So it's basically, if you get into development, it's sort of, JavaScript is sort of the programming language, if you will, of web pages. Sort of one of the more basic sort of front ends, if you will, in terms of coding or development. D3 is a wonderful library to sort of try out different types of visualizations. Definitely a little bit of a learning curve to it, but it still gets you kind of going in terms of some of these ideas. If you're interested in something that's a little, again, this has a little bit of a learning curve to it. If you're interested in sort of getting, kind of baby steps into data visualization, I'd highly recommend checking out something called Vega Lite. I'll show that right now. Again, free to utilize in terms of its open source in that regard. Has some great examples. So some examples here. Very straight, a lot easier to sort of walk through some of these examples. A good sort of starting place if you're interested in getting into making some of these data visualization. Try this out first. It uses D3 for a lot of what you're seeing. So basically, once you kind of get a good handle on this, coming back to D3, you have to learn some of the little nuances and stuff like that. But again, it's sort of a nice little way to kind of get yourself, your feet wet, if you will, to getting some data visualizations together. So for ours, again, what we're doing is we're creating, D3 uses something called SVG, or Scalable Vector Graphics. Vector graphics is sort of the way it's generating these plots. It's reading in a file, and it's mapping it to an X and Y coordinate plot. And what we're mapping is basically the date that the data was getting collected and the antibody value. So it's using that sort of as our plot. Let me bring that back up real quick. There we go. Oh, sorry. Basic. And there we go. And so we see at the bottom we have all the years of the data that's provided to us and antibody value. And it goes from, I think, basically right above 0 to up to about 1800. So basically, this is where we started. So we started with that first sketch, and then here's basically the first conversation and the first thing that I actually coded for the faculty member. So this is our first design, and so what I'm going to do is go back here. Oh, one other thing I'll make mention of is that while you're developing, you might want to double check and sort of, you might run into errors or issues with the code. It is coding, so obviously there's a way to debug this type of information, and I'll show you how to do this in Chrome. So let me do that right now. So in here, I have my project up and running, and what you can do is, and move that over. If you click little dots over here and go to More Tools and then Developer Tools, or Control-Shift-I, if you want a shortcut, you're going to have a prompt show up. And basically in here is your development tools. And specifically under this console is where you're going to see errors that sort of pop up. So let me make an error. So save and refresh. It's going to say, oh, we ran into an issue. Basically, this combination of letters I just put on here is not defined. So it's not a variable, it's not a string. It's basically just it's an error. So it tells me where it is. It tells me which line it's on, so it can highlight. So it's easy for me to debug it. Come back, make sure everything works okay. Let's delete that, save, reload, and no errors. Everything is good, basically. But as you develop more code, you're going to use the debugger or console down here to kind of make sure that things are working properly. If you get any errors, you're gonna be able to check here and see specifically where that actual code is referencing and where the error is actually specifically occurring. So a great way to sort of debug things. Okay. So I kind of already walked through this, and so at the technical level, we've talked about getting our web server up and running, securing it so it basically only listens to that local traffic. We moved our project into our ht.doc folder so we can actually run and utilize this. And we talked very basically sort of what makes up a web page, and hopefully you have some links now that you can kind of check out and sort of see as we're developing how we actually develop this particular project. So moving back into the human factors side of the conversation, we're going to start talking about something called front-end analysis. And what front-end analysis is basically, they're kind of common questions I'll ask a faculty member when I'm starting to develop these projects. Who are the end users that are going to be utilizing this? And what type of environment will this be utilized? What are the tasks? So what does he need to have accomplished, or what will his users need to have accomplished? And what functions, what things that the system has to do to sort of facilitate completing those particular tasks. The first thing we'll talk about is something called the user analysis. Again, that's who's going to be utilizing this system. One of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to teaching this particular thing to students is the idea that when I talk to students, I'll ask, hey, you know, when we talk about users, who's using the system? A lot of times I'll get sort of feedback based on, you know, from them saying, well, everyone's going to be using this particular sort of thing. Everybody is my user group, basically. And so I always tell them, you know, I have this slide pop up and sort of say, no, that you can't assume that everyone is going to utilize what you're trying to put together. difference between, another faculty member seeing this information versus my 3-year-old daughter seeing a kind of situation. Like there's going to be some specific people that are going to be utilizing this particular web page or visualization, and we need to design specifically for that. Things to think about in terms of the user analysis: age, gender, educational level, reading ability, basically a lot of task relevant skills and familiarity to the product kind of idea as well. So for us, it was basically fellow researchers or doctors, roughly 25 to 60, gender, both male and female, and then familiarity with the product. They would be familiar to the concept, but the idea itself is very novel. So it's basically a novel way of actually presenting this information. Environment sort of goes into where this is going to be utilized, and this is actually more crucial than most people think. Typically, you'll think about things like location, temperature, lighting, things like that, weather, noise, stuff like that. And again, that's more for any types of system. So for us, we had to consider the fact that he wanted to present this information at a conference, which he did not know if he would have Wi-Fi access. It was meant to be doing a presentation. And also he wanted to provide a voiceover while he was showcasing the particular visualization. And that's why the final product ended up being an animation. He could download it, embed it into one of his PowerPoints, and just sort of push play and have it play out as well. Another thing that this sort of brought up is the fact that while we were developing it, and if we're going to be using it for an animation, we actually had to talk about putting a script together. So he would give me information, so I knew where pauses needed to be and where text needed to be as well. So a couple crucial things were learned through the environment sort of analysis. Task basically is, what does a task need to do? What are tasks? What do users need in terms of completing? What tasks are they interested in having, and how do we sort of accomplish those tasks? So the functions needed to do that. For us, it was present a novel idea that showcased the 2 specific scenes. And so the function basically means the visualization would have to smoothly transition between those 2 different scenes. So basically, when data was at the top of the screen, and then moving to specifically the other sort of visualization at the bottom. Task number 2 was basically show small examples to build to larger ideas. And so for us, we decided, instead of showing all of the information at once, we were just going to showcase one specific year, so 2015. So basically taking the entire set and then specifically kind of talking about specific points first, then introducing sort of a year, and then giving the whole data set at that point. So a couple things: design for short video, something that can be embedded into a PowerPoint, and develop a script for small data sets to 1 year to all the data. In terms of design, one of the best ways to actually go about doing a design sort of process, if you will, is the idea of iterative design process. It would be, sometimes it's a situation where, again, I'll kind of reference some of the students I've worked with over my time with teaching and things of that nature. They always kind of, the idea is that they would have a project and a deadline for a project. They would put all the project, they would develop the project, and at the end of it, they would just hand over the project to the teacher. So they would turn in the assignment, if you will. And in situations where something like this is going to be used in a presentation, we need to have sort of a back and forth between myself and that faculty member. So we will start with basically that sketch. We'll have first draft, second draft, third draft, all these drafts basically till we get to a final product. And that's basically this iterative design process. I'd like to showcase it. Again, I'm only going to show about 2 minutes, I think 2.5 minutes of this particular TED Talk. It's about 8 minutes long. I'd highly recommend maybe coming back to it and checking out the rest of it. But it talks about sort of this iterative design idea, specifically for something called the Marshmallow Challenge. So I'm going to mute myself here and put this back on play. So again, I'm only going to show a couple minutes of this.
Several years ago here at TED, Peter Skillman introduced a design challenge called the Marshmallow Challenge. And the idea is pretty simple. Teams of 4 have to build the tallest freestanding structure out of 20 sticks of spaghetti, 1 yard of tape, 1 yard of string, and a marshmallow. And the marshmallow has to be on top. And though it seems really simple, it's actually pretty hard because it forces people to collaborate very quickly. And so I thought this was an interesting idea, and I incorporated it into a design workshop, and it was a huge success. And since then, I've conducted about 70 design workshops across the world with students and designers and architects, even the CTOs of the Fortune 50. And there's something about this exercise that reveals very deep lessons about the nature of collaboration, and I'd like to share some of them with you. So, normally, most people begin by orienting themselves to the task. They talk about it, they figure out what it's going to look like, they jockey for power, then they spend some time planning, organizing, they sketch in, they lay out spaghetti. They spend the majority of their time assembling the sticks into ever-growing structures, and then finally, just as they're running out of time, someone takes out the marshmallow, and then they gingerly put it on top, and they stand back, and ta-da! They admire their work. But what really happens most of the time is that the ta-da turns into an uh-oh, because the weight of the marshmallow causes the entire structure to buckle and to collapse. So there are a number of people who have a lot more uh-oh moments than others. And among the worst are recent graduates of business school. It's amazing. They lie, they cheat, they get distracted, and they produce really lame structures. And of course, there's teams that have a lot more ta-da structures, and among the best are recent graduates of kindergarten. And it's pretty amazing, as Peter tells us. Not only do they produce the tallest structures, but they're the most interesting structures of them all. So the question you want to ask is, how come? Why? What is it about them? And Peter likes to say that none of the kids spend any time trying to be CEO of Spaghetti Inc., right? They don't spend time jockeying for power. But there's another reason as well. And the reason is that business students are trained to find the single right plan. Right? And then they execute on it. And then what happens is when they put the marshmallow on top, they run out of time, and what happens? It's a crisis. Sound familiar, right? Okay. What kindergartners do differently is that they start with the marshmallow and they build prototypes, successive prototypes, always keeping the marshmallow on top. So they have multiple times to fix, and they build prototypes along the way. So designers recognize this type of collaboration as the essence of the iterative process. And with each version, kids get instant feedback about what works and what doesn't work. So
Okay, and so again, a couple more minutes. Goes into sort of a conversation about how when incentives are used as well, to how that changes sort of the construction and how well it actually is done in terms of complete structure. Kind of a cool sort of finish for that as well. So check it out if you're interested. But it sort of just sort of highlights sort of specifically highlights. The idea that, basically we have to think about design processes in terms of iterative design. It can't just be a funnel, marshmallow on top of the design process. Last thing in terms of sort of just kind of things to consider, critiquing. I bring this in here just to kind of on the last two sort of points, basically. If you're working and you're working with a faculty member, you want to make sure that when you get sort of feedback, you're getting an idea of why they sort of have a sort of that particular feeling, so you can kind of make sure you design specifically for that why and make actionable suggestions. So basically, when you're trying to get it feedback, make sure we have a good plan put in place for the next iteration, if you will. So back to the technical side of things. So this was our first design. And basically, I sent this out. We started working from there. I have a couple little emails back and forth. One of the nice things about sort of starting at this level, it was one, we were able to find an issue with my code in terms of, I mentioned that this was months when actually it should have been weeks. So they should have been basically per week and then per year as well. And so we were able to correct that. I had some questions about the data and sort of the max values As you can see, there was a lot of max values up here, and I was kind of wondering about that. And I was able to kind of get that feedback to get our second round put together. Things I learned from that process was that anything that had a value of 0 or NA, we need to remove it. Months should be mapped to weeks specifically, not month to month kind of situation. And also, sorry. We were concerned with, we were comparing the date taken of the antibody count versus the antibody value and the date that was taken versus the antibody count itself. So a histogram sort of final display. And so here, the second iteration of this basically kind of put these two ideas together. So we have our two plots, and I'll show that real quick here. Second design. So this was the second design. And so basically, we see a lot more data being filled in because I changed it from months to weeks. We also were, we have a couple of simple interactions at this point. So anything with an NA value or 0 is immediately removed, which happened to be values basically a little bit above, or a little bit, basically around 150 and lower. And so we got that out of the way. And then the next thing we did was I wanted to transition smoothly from the top plot down to the bottom plot. And that's what you're seeing here right now. This worked in terms of kind of getting some ideas together, but we weren't satisfied at that version as well. So what we talked about, and I'll talk about that right now. First of all, the first animation needed to be quicker. It was basically very quick. We didn't need to really see that information, so that had to be sped up a bit. That is set up in batches. One of the things that I was told about was because of these sort of weekly sort of pooling of information or testing or something to that effect, that a lot of the information was actually pooled, so you could actually see specific sort of patterns in the data. And let me refresh this. So you can kind of see that there's data, gap, data, gap, data, gap, data, gap, and so on and so forth. And so could we use that to our advantage to sort of tell our story, if you will? Okay. The next thing is also to slow down the second animation. Originally, as you can kind of see here, basically, kind of, I'll just say random values were sort of being moved from the top to the bottom, and we needed to show that in a more elegant way as well, just to kind of tell that story better. And so, oh, sorry, I have the wrong image here, but I'll show you the final one for what we have. This is our third design. So a couple things we changed on this is that we decided to color code these weekly sort of bins, if you will. And again, you can see data, nothing, data, nothing, data, nothing. So we were able to sort of, I'll just say loosely cluster on this information. We're focusing on just on 2015. Well, one other thing we did, but that I didn't mention specifically, was we had a common x-axis. So we have the date time lined up, so we can tell that if something is happening up here, we can map it directly to the sort of same timeline. Now, when I click, very quick, get rid of that data. Click again, and we transition. And what it's doing now is actually transitioning from the lower values up to the higher values of the antibody. And you can kind of see the lower values map farther back versus the higher values, so which makes sense in that regard. So I'll let this kind of play out for a second here, but this was sort of our kind of takeaway in terms of one of our sort of our good sort of final product, as you will. There was a couple designs in between all this and whatnot, but for the most part, this was sort of what we were looking to accomplish and sort of tell that specific story. Couple other things, basically, same at the top and the bottom. We kind of already mentioned a lot of this information. What we learned in terms of, we also filtered the data and clustered basically on that weekly sort of data collection. So if you're interested, and so you put together this animation, and now you want to sort of put it together in terms of recording it and creating an actual animation. For Mac users, I think Mac natively has something that you can use to record your screen. But if you're a Windows user, I highly recommend something called the Open Broadcast Software, or OBS. A lot of people are utilizing this now for recording videos and putting them on like YouTube. or streaming on streaming services that are out there. But it's an very easy way to record actual video for your project. So it's also free as well, so you can sort of play around with it and actually record some of these animations. And so you can do that for projects as well. And one other thing I'll mention about that is when I finish up a video, sometimes PowerPoint has some issues with encoding issues or something to that effect. Another website, it's free to utilize if you're only using for smaller projects. It's called Cloud Convert. You drop your video file, your MP4 or whatever file that your video is, and then you can change it to different formats, make sure it's the right encoding for PowerPoint and all that stuff. So this is a great resource to utilize. So yeah, that kind of hits specifically everything I wanted to talk about today. We talked about sort of going through some of the human factors of design, things to consider, ideas to consider as well. We talked about how we sort of approach projects in terms of things to consider in terms of affordances, anti-affordances, conceptual models, mapping, everything of that nature. And so you kind of get that relationship. Also, we talked about sort of introducing the project and walking through some of the basic steps. We talked about paper prototyping and sort of that iterative design process. Some of the common questions I get into in terms of that front-end analysis. So who are we designing for? What environment will be utilized? And then sort of finalizing that project. So from here, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today. I'd like to stay on the line here just so if there are any kind of questions, I can answer them now. If there are follow-up questions, feel free to email me at pmd19@psu.edu, and I'll be happy to sort of follow up with you on that regard as well. If there's any kind of clarification, always feel free to email me in this regards. But again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. This is our last workshop for at least the summer. Hopefully we'll be coming back with these in the fall. So if you have any suggestions, again, email me or check out the survey that I'll be sending out probably tomorrow morning, and provide some feedback so I know how to design some of these for moving forward. So again, thank you for coming out. I'll keep an eye on the chat here. Okay. So if there's any questions, if not, again, thank you for coming out today, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to check out designing some data visualization and the human factors involved with it. You're welcome, everyone. I very much appreciate you coming out to talk to hear me talk today. So again, feel free to email me or contact me, and I'll be happy to have a follow-up with you as well. So there was a question in terms of the video. I do record these, and I send this off to the Institute for CyberSciences, and they actually will have it on their YouTube page. So if you check out their YouTube page, again, it's ICS, or Institute for CyberSciences. Their YouTube page through Penn State, well, they're at Penn State Department, and they have a YouTube channel. You'll eventually see it up on there as well. So it will be made available afterwards. Okay. Mm-hmm. Again, if there's any follow-up questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to address them. If not, again, thank you for coming out today. I'm going to close up things on my end here. If there's any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me. I'll put my email address in the chat below. Feel free to email me and I'll be happy to follow up. But I'm going to close out for today. Again, thank you for coming out today.